Hello and welcome back to Bicyclelegs Talks Music and another special episode. And this one's a bit of a part 2 to one that I did last year. And that is I'm going to be doing a part 2 of artists that only ever released one album. Or as a lot of people would call them, one and done artists. And again, I'm trying not to go for any of the too obvious choices here, although one of them I think is one that a few other people have definitely talked about. I feel like a lot of these are going to be ones that other music YouTube people just haven't talked about. And again, I've picked 10. So let's get into it. The first two and the last two are a little bit related to each other, so you'll see that as we go along. But the first one I'm going to talk about is a progressive rock album from 1971. The band was formed in the UK, although their keyboard player was from Switzerland. You may think you know the band I'm talking about. That one's coming, but this one is actually a band called Mainhorse. And the keyboard player from Switzerland in question, of course, is Patrick Moraz. This is the first band that he was in that sort of had a record contract and got some traction as far as getting stuff released and that sort of thing. You can definitely hear early on here, you know, Patrick Moraz's talents as a great keyboard player. And he's already, you know, not just playing piano, he's playing organ, he's playing synthesizer, playing electric piano, doing some of the backing vocals as well, which I don't think we really see much of in bands that he goes into later on. You also have Peter Lockett on lead guitar, violin and vocals, Jean Ristori on bass, cello and vocals, and Bryson Graham on drums and percussion. So what do you get on this album? It's definitely a progressive rock album. It's really good. There's no sort of full-blown epics on this album. There are definitely some slightly lengthier tracks. You've got the wonderful introduction. You've got Passing Years, which is really, really good. Such a Beautiful Day. Pale Sky, that rounds out side one. Pale Sky is the only song on here where Jean Ristori writes the music rather than Patrick Moraz. Very much this is a Patrick Moraz-led project, as quite a few of his projects would be, except of course for his one album with Yes. But it's a really good album. On side 2 you have Bassier, More T Vicar, which is an instrumental, and you get the rather wonderful God to close out the album. It's definitely recommended, especially if you're a Patrick Moraz fan and you've never listened to the Mainhorse album. I would definitely recommend it. Now the one that he would then go on to do, which I think more people know, was from 1974, and that is of course Refugee. Now this included Lee Jackson and Brian Davidson, who'd both been in The Nice with Keith Emerson. So some people kind of saw this as a bit of a Nice part 2. But Patrick Moraz is not a Keith Emerson in the way he plays and that sort of thing. Both enormously talented keyboard players, but very, very different styles. Patrick Moraz, I mean, more like what you would hear on that Yes album, Relayer. Not quite to that extent, but definitely you can hear some of that here. And again, you know, this is all the music is written by Patrick Moraz. The lyrics are by Lee Jackson. You know, on the sort of longer tracks, the arrangement is credited to the whole band. Produced by John Burns, who was, you know, he produced some of those great early 70s Genesis albums. This is on Charisma label, which is the same label as Genesis 2. But you get Papillon, which is a sort of great instrumental to open the album. You get the wonderful Someday, but then you get the epic Grand Canyon Suite, which closes out side 1. Really, really good piece of music. Love it to death. Then you get another couple of instrumentals on side 2 with Gatecrasher and Rhythmically. He would actually, Patrick Moraz would use Rhythmically as sort of like the basis for his keyboard solo a little bit when he was in Yes, at least in the early part of his tenure with Yes. And then you get another really sort of great long track with Credo. This is progressive rock at some of its finest. They wanted to go on and do more albums, but Patrick Moraz got the call to come and join Yes, and he felt like that was an offer he couldn't refuse. And unfortunately, that was the end of Refugee, and we would never get another album from them, which is really, really sad because it's a great album. Sticking in the progressive rock manner for the next one, but we're coming to my homeland, to Australia. And just a little bit of a prelude to this one. There used to be an Australian progressive rock band called Sebastian Hardy. Great, great band. I've talked about them over on Rock Daydream Nation with Peter Kerr, where we've done our all Aussie Wrecking Crew panels. I've talked about their first album, Four Moments, which is a wonderful album. Their second album was called Windchase, but then after that, they kind of broke in half. They were a four-piece band. You had Mario Millo on guitar and Toivo Pilt on keyboards, and then you had the Plavsic brothers as the rhythm section on bass and drums. They kind of split in two, and the Plavsic brothers owned the rights to the name Sebastian Hardy. So Mario Millo and Toivo Pilt had to sort of move on with a different name. They ended up choosing the name of that second Sebastian Hardy album as the name of their new band. And the band therefore is called Windchase, but they only did the one album, and that is Symfinity. This is from 1977, so not a good time to be bringing out a progressive rock album because, you know, punk was in full flare by this stage. The progressive rock bands were sort of going the way of the dinosaur. And progressive rock just was never as popular here in Australia as it was in Europe and the US. But yeah, this is a great album. If you know the sort of symphonic progressive rock that Sebastian Hardy used to do, Sebastian Hardy would come back and do another album sort of much, much later. I first saw Sebastian Hardy as opening act to Yes in, I think it was 2003. And they were the only opening act I've ever seen get a standing ovation. But back to the Windchase album, it's definitely got that sort of symphonic rock feel of Sebastian Hardy, but also with a definitely getting into a bit of a jazz fusion sort of thing that Sebastian Hardy didn't really have. It's really, really wonderful album. There's 8 tracks on it in total, so the tracks are a little bit shorter than the tracks you would get on those first 2 Sebastian Hardy albums. And it's kind of evenly split as far as the writing credits go between Mario Millo and Toivo Pilt, which, again, those first 2 Sebastian Hardy albums very much dominated by the writing of Mario Millo. But yeah, you get wonderful tracks like Forward We Ride, Horseman to Symfinity, Glad to Be Alive, Gypsy's really good, No Scruples I like, Lamb's Fry, Non Siamo Perfetti, I'm probably butchering that pronunciation because I don't speak Italian, and Flight Call to end the album. Definitely worth checking out if you can. I don't know if it's available on streaming services or not, but go and have a look and see if it is. If not, you should be able to find it on somewhere like YouTube. So if you're into that sort of symphonic progressive rock with a little bit of a sort of jazz fusion bent to it, definitely recommend this album. Now, to get completely out of sort of progressive rock, I don't think any of our last sort of 7 albums have got anything to do with progressive rock. I'm going to look at an album from 1981. It's the only studio album by this band. Wonderful New Zealand band in this case. I am talking about the Swingers with Practical Jokers. This is a band formed by Phil Judd after he'd been in Split Enz. He went back to New Zealand. He got involved with a band called Suburban Reptiles, which were like an early New Zealand punk band. A couple of the other guys from Suburban Reptiles kind of followed him out of that band and ended up forming into the Swingers. This is a great album. It's straight ahead, it's a bit pogo-y, but it's a bit new wavy, it's definitely got that Phil Judd weirdness to it, which, you know, absolutely great. Of course, the song everybody knows off this album is, well, everybody here in Australia and New Zealand anyway, probably not so much outside of Australia and New Zealand, but the Swingers had a massive hit here with a song called Counting the Beat, which went to #1. It Ain't What You Dance, It's the Way That You Dance It also was a bit of a hit, but this album didn't do particularly well, unfortunately. It's a shame because it's got some great stuff on it. The title track, Practical Joker, is great. One Track Mind, Lovesick, More, True or False, Ayatollah is really, really good. 5 O'Clock Shadow, Funny Feeling, Distortion, and I always really, really like the closing track, Hit the Beach. It's produced by David Tickle, who of course produced True Colours and Corroboree for Split Enz. He also produced a bunch of other stuff. He was still a very young guy when he did these albums. And yeah, it's a well-recommended album if you're into that sort of slightly punky sort of new wave sort of feel. Something if you're familiar with Phil Judd but you don't really know the Swingers, definitely get into it. It's really, really good. They're concise songs. They're well-written songs though. Definitely worth checking out. Going to go back to Australia for our next choice, and this is a sort of synth pop album with a bit of a sort of new wave feel as well. One and only album by this band, was released in 1984, and the album is Ransom Note by a band called Dear Enemy. Again, a bit of a one-hit wonder here in Australia. The opening track on this album is a song called Computer One. Was a hit for them here in Australia, but then they really didn't have a backup hit for it. And after this album did okay, but didn't do great numbers, the band kind of ended up petering out. But Computer One is not the only thing on this album that's worth listening to. I think this is a great album. The Good Life is really good, Talking to You, All Through the Night. Slightly lengthier tracks for those sort of pop songs because you've only got 4 tracks on side 1, you get 5 on side 2, with Kids on the Street, On the Line, Restless is really good, Bit of Your Heart and Day to Day to close out the album. That's really, it's an interesting lineup. It's 2 guitars, bass, drums, keyboards, and vocalist, so you've got a 6-piece band, but it definitely has that sort of a bit of an ultravoxy kind of vibe to the keyboards, but you get more guitar than you would maybe with some of the other synth pop bands, which definitely sort of throws it into more of the new wave or new romantic kind of thing. Definitely check this album out if you're into those sort of styles of music, if you're into your synth pops, your new waves, your new romantics, that sort of thing. Well worth checking out. Now the next album we're going to have a look at, it was released in 1987. It was the only album obviously by this artist because that's what we're talking about today. But it was a precursor to something much, much bigger in a lot of ways. The album is Dry Land by How We Live. Now, How We Live were a duo of Colin Wood and Steve Hogarth. Yes, that's Steve Hogarth, who would end up, after this album, joining Marillion and becoming their new lead singer, and he's still their new lead singer to this day, still working with the band and still doing great, great stuff. Now, those of you who are Marillion fans would know that the title track of this album, Dry Land, was actually covered by Marillion on the Holidays in Eden album. So, Colin Wood and Steve Hogarth, before How We Live, had been in a band called Europeans. Europeans did 2 studio albums and 1 live album. Originally, Ferg Harper was the lead singer of Europeans, and on the first Europeans album, Steve Hogarth only sings one song. He's primarily the keyboard player. He sang more on the second album, and then, as I say, he and Colin Waugh split off and formed How We Live. What's this music like? You know, a lot of people accused Marillion when Steve Hogarth joined the band, especially with the Holidays and Eden album, of them becoming poppy. There's some pop on this album, but I would describe this as, you know, what they called in the UK big music. You know, especially if you think of sort of mid to late 80s Simple Minds and that sort of thing. It's got that sort of widescreen kind of sound to it, if you know what I mean. Especially on a track like Dry Land, the title track. But also Games in Germany has got that widescreen. There's definitely more poppy bits to it too. I mean, Working Girl. But there's really great songs on here. All the Time in the World is great. India is wonderful, kind of moody and atmospheric, which I really like. The Rainbow Room on side 2 is a great way to open the second side of the album. Lost at Sea is good. In the City. Working Town, not to be confused with Working Girl. Sort of getting at Steve Hogarth's working class roots in the lyrics for that song. And it closes out with A Beat in the Heart. If you like that sort of late 80s, early 90s Marillion, but you're also into, like I say, sort of that mid to late 80s Simple Minds, that sort of thing. Maybe even some of the stuff that U2 was doing around that time too. Not so much in how much guitar and that sort of thing is, but just in the sweep and the sort of all-encompassingness, if that's even a word, of the sound of this album. Definitely check this out. If you're a Marillion fan and you've never listened to How We Live, definitely check it out. It's worth it just to hear what the original Dry Land was like, because a lot of what ended up being in the Marillion version is there in the How We Live version, but then, you know, you add your Steve Rothery's and your Mark Kelly's, adding their sort of fairy dust to it. It really does take it to another dimension. Really, really good album though, and some great songwriting from Steve Hogarth in particular. Well worth checking out if you haven't already. Staying in 1987, but going for something completely different sounding. This band only ever did one studio album. They did do an EP as well. They did contribute some tracks to soundtracks. But this is the only full-length album that they ever did. This is something I only discovered last year, and it's probably my favourite discovery for 2024 of an older band. The band is Fibonaccis, and the album is called Civilization and Its Discotheques. How would you describe this album? It's definitely new wave. There's a bit of post-punk in it. But there's also like mellotrons and things like that. There's a lot of mellotron on this album. It's not a progressive rock album by any stretch. It's definitely got a bit of Frank Zappa going to it. It's definitely off-kilter and off-beat, and I really, really like that about it. This is, as I say, this is my favourite discovery of 2024. Love this album to death. I listened to it first on streaming, and then it was like, I have to track down a copy of this album, and thankfully I was able to get one not too expensive off Discogs, which is where I get a lot of the sort of more obscure stuff that I'm not going to find in a record store here in Australia. You've got mostly female lead vocals, but you've also got some male lead vocals. It's wonderful. They were sort of contemporaries early on with Wall of Voodoo. The EP that they put out was on Index label, which is the same label that put out Wall of Voodoo's first EP. Terrific, terrific album. Go and check this out. If you never listened to the Fibonaccis, you know, do yourself a favour, as Molly Meldrum from Countdown would say. March to Heaven is great. Narcissist. Had It With Girls. Really, really good song. Crickets, Leroy, The Thread. You know, there's 6 songs on each side of the album, so it's not, you know, they're not long tracks or anything like that. Stay Home is wonderful. Medicine Waltz. Great song. Some Men, Old Mean, Ed Jean, really, really good song. Bit of wry humour and that sort of thing in it. And how's this for a song title? You got Romp of the Meiji Sycophants. I mean, just great. And it's a really, really good song, and it closes out with a great song called The Snap. I cannot recommend this album highly enough. Check it out if you've never heard the Fibonaccis. If you're into sort of off-kilter, slightly different sounding music, with sort of a new wave sound, an 80s sound, but definitely with a Frank Zappa influence and, you know, that sort of thing. Fibonacci's definitely something you can get into. Now the next album, we're coming back to Australia. This was released in 1990. This group were mostly known as a comedy act, like stand-up comedy and that sort of thing. Their stand-up would have some songs in it as well. They did plenty of sort of live albums of their stand-up act and that sort of thing, but they only ever did one studio album. And the studio album they did is not really... I mean, some of the songs are funny, obviously, and some of the songs were in their stage show. But this is a music album. This is a well-produced album. It's definitely meant to be a collection of songs rather than a collection of comedy skits. It shows that this band weren't just great comedians, but also great musicians. And I'm talking about the Doug Anthony All-Stars and their only studio album, Das Icon. I mean, just such a great album. You know, it just goes to show that this band were enormously talented. I mean, look at this artwork too, you know. It's just absolutely great. But, you know, it starts off with the wonderful Commies for Christ, which is a really great sort of, you know, rap kind of song. My Baby's Gone to Jail is a really sort of rock and roll rave up. Jack is this mostly a cappella, creepy. It's not a humorous song. It definitely creates a almost, you know, it's about like some guy stuck in a mine shaft, like when there's been a cave in and that sort of thing. And the atmospheres are just wonderful. Change the Blades is another rave up, which is really good. Krishna, you know, musically really up-tempo, and that it's one of the funniest songs on the album about sort of, you know, getting into Hare Krishna and all that sort of thing. Shang-a-Lang is great. Little Gospel Song is absolutely beautiful and played straight. You know, it's not played as a comedy song. It's played as a straight gospel song. Really, really good song. Dead Elvis, another really funny song. It's got that great sort of, you know, 50s rock and roll kind of vibe to it. You get on to side 2, you get the wonderful I Want to Spill the Blood of a Hippie, which was the single off the album. You know, a funny song, but also a kind of confronting song in a lot of ways. Go to Church is really, really funny. But again, musically, really, really good. It's kind of got that hip-hop wallop to it. Rat. I mean, it's great. Again, kind of bizarre, but it sounds like Gregorian chant. And, you know, one of the things I love about this album is just the range of musical styles on here. Again, as I said earlier, showing that they were musicians as well as comedians. 2X is this really sort of moody and creepy sounding, mostly instrumental piece with like little whispered creepy things that you can't quite make out and all that sort of thing. Motorcycle Saint Sebastian's another one of their sort of rave up songs. Really, really good. But then it closes with the absolutely heartbreaking song Bottle, which again, a totally straight song. It's a ballad. It's about alcohol addiction. It's just heart melting. It's, you know, if you thought of the Doug Anthony All-Stars as just these sort of like comedians on stage doing a lot of very confrontational humor a lot of the time, check this album out, because I mean, some of that's here for sure, but there's a lot of different sides to the Doug Anthony All-Stars that you find on this album. Absolutely love this album. The next album we're going to have a look at is one that I was kind of ended up being the reason I'm doing this show, because I did my first one and done album show and I was absolutely kicking myself when I'd finished recording it that I hadn't included this album, because I love this album, and it's, you know, just a classic, I think, case of a one and done album, and that is Rochambeau by the Greys. The Greys, kind of a supergroup in a lot of ways. You've got Jason Faulkner, you've got John Bryan, you've got Buddy Judge, you've got Dan McCarroll. You know, they all contribute to the songwriting, they all contribute to the playing. They wanted to be a band that, you know, was a little bit more anonymous, that wasn't, you know, led by one particular person, that was very much a collective. Unfortunately, it ended up falling apart because the record company didn't really see it that way, and they started to push Jason Faulkner as being the leader of the band, and the rest of the band didn't like that, and it ended up making it fall apart. What do you get on here? I mean, if you're a Jellyfish fan and you don't know the Greys, you need to get on this. It's not as retro as Jellyfish is, but it's definitely got that wonderful power pop kind of sound to it, and everybody contributes. It's a wonderful album. You know, Very Best Years is great kickoff song. Everybody's World, same thing. Friend of Mine is really great. Is It Now Yet? Or Well Maybe, or Oh Well Maybe, sorry. Nothing Between Us is really good. Both Belong, Nothing. Not Long for This World is great. Spooky, All You Wanted, and Nothing Can Hurt Me. I mean, it's a really consistent album, considering you have, you know, various writers and singers on this album. It ends up having a consistent sound because of the production, probably. Really good album. If you don't know it, I mean, it's not just the Jason Faulkner songs here. I really love the John Bryan songs as well. I think he's an underrated talent. I know my son really likes John Bryan. So, yeah, unfortunately, as I say, they would only do this one album and then they would go off and do different things. Jason Faulkner would start a solo career. I have to do a video about his first solo album one of these days because it's one of my favourite albums in the world. John Bryan would do solo stuff. He would also do, I think, some soundtrack work and that sort of thing. So, yeah, many years later, though, in 2006, Jason Faulkner would hook up with his old Jellyfish mate, Roger Joseph Manning, and we would get this album here, TV Eyes. And, you know, Brian Rietzel is involved with this as well. There's the three of them. This album definitely not sort of Jellyfishy retro. This is more sort of 80s retro. You know, new wave, synth pop, that sort of thing. It's a wonderful album. And if you're a fan of what, you know, Jason Faulkner does, if you're a fan of what Roger Joseph Manning Jr. does, if you don't know this album, you need to check it out because it is absolutely wonderful. It starts with the incredible Over the City. Fascinating. She's a Study. One of the best songs on the album. The Party's Over is great. Mission Submission's another song I really like. Love to Need, What She Said, Fade Away, Time's Up. It's just a wonderful album from beginning to end. Again, very much with that kind of 80s sound. Well worth checking out if you're into that sort of thing. Or again, as I say, if you're a fan of Roger Joseph Manning, or you're a fan of Jellyfish, or you're a fan of Jason Faulkner, and you don't know this album, you need to rectify that because it's a terrific album. So there you have it, everyone. That's another 10 one and done albums from me. Please let me know in the comments if there are any one and done albums that I didn't cover, either in my first one, which I'll leave a link in the description for the first show, or in this one. Let me know some of your favourite one and done albums. Of these ones in particular, let me know which ones of these albums are your favourites. Or what I'd really love is, if you don't know some of these albums, and you go and listen to them for the first time. Let me know in the comments what you thought of them, because I'd really love to know. Please do like, share and subscribe. It really does help the channel out. If you're new to the channel, please go and have a look at some of my other videos. I have everything playlisted, so if you want to look at some of my other special episodes, I have a playlist for those. If you want to look at some of my Bicyclelegs Discovers Rush series, I have a playlist for those. If you want to see my appearances on other people's channels, I also have a playlist for those. If you want to follow me on social media, I'm at bicyclelegs on Instagram, Twitter, and a bunch of other places. I also have a dedicated Bicyclelegs Facebook page. Links are all in the doobly-doo. Please do give those all a follow and join in the conversation. I'd really love to have you there. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.